Hello, I'm Dr. Katherine Horton. I would like to explain in this video remote neural monitoring. And I'll just give the very, very basics so that when people approach you and they say, I'm a victim of remote neural monitoring, you don't just write them off as crazy or something like that. And to understand what they're saying, you have to know a bit about very, very modern technology that's currently being literally trialed on people. So the person who approaches you and might say, I'm a victim of remote neural monitoring, just like the victim who might approach you and say, I'm a victim of organized stalking, or I'm a victim of microwave weapons, you have to know what to look for. You have to know what the current status is of science and of weapons technology to be able to assess what they're saying and put it into context. Because if you do not understand the context, these people might be saying something that actually exists and you just write them off as crazy, which will mean that you're not actually there for another human being who's approaching you, begging you for help. So that's why you have to understand these things. It is, I think, your civic duty to do so, even if it's scary, even if it sounds out there. So I will do my best to explain this technology, but you have to know that this technology is more or less classified. So what we do know about this technology are patents from the 1970s. And there are some patents that are stem from the 1990s, which have expired. And whistleblowers have come forward and they've actually said this technology is now being used on people in an illegal fashion. So crimes like that are being committed with a known technology, and the actual effects might be scary. So I'm not going to swamp you with the patents. You can find them yourself. I might put a link down there, but what I want to say, roughly describe how this technology works, and I will be very hand wavy, so all the real key experts, don't just stomp on my head if I'm imprecise, because what I would like to do is explain this to people who maybe do not know anything about physics, okay, or nothing about technology. So essentially there's this new capability that we have, which is called remote neural monitoring. And what it essentially is reading out your brain functions remotely. And you can, as you can imagine, if you could read out a human being's brain remotely, you can probably also perhaps influence it remotely, and that's exactly the problem. So when victims come forward and they say, I'm a victim, they might be the victim of a horrific crime. That's essentially absolutely a world premiere, essentially. This sort of crime has never been there before, has never been seen before, and that's why law enforcement, lawyers, judges, and doctors might have never heard about it, because it's actually using very modern technology. What it is at its core is essentially the following thing. When you are, for example, moving your arms about, or when you're thinking about a certain topic, when you're processing information, like whatever goes through your eyes, or your ears, and you're hearing sound, or you're seeing colors, or you're seeing images, and then you're reacting to them, or you're doing sport and you're moving your limbs to play volleyball or whatever, play football. This is all done with electrical signals inside your head. And every electrical signal is like a small current running along on the wiring in your head, if you like, and along your spine, and these signals are sent into your arms and your limbs, and your brain is wired up so everything can be steered. When I'm moving my fingers, it's essentially all steered through my head, through my spine, through this neural system. Okay, but what you essentially have is electrical signals traveling. But every single electrical signal is a little electric current, a little pulse traveling along, a conductor, if you like. Now, every single time current runs along a conductor, it generates an electromagnetic field, always. It is impossible to send current without the moving current generating an electromagnetic field. And this is, kind of radiated off, and it's broadcast off. So if you manage to read out that field, then you can reconstruct the strength of the current and in what direction it's flowing. Do you see? Now, what you can do, if you just had a wire with current on, you could measure the field and you could tell that there's a current running along, and you could also tell, is it going from, from is plus and minus here, or is it the other way around? So you can read this out. And what you have to do for that, to read it out remotely, is to have sensors around that. Okay. So when you go and you have an EEG, what you're essentially reading out is the signal, this electromagnetic field that the current generates. So you can read out pulses, and that's why you can have little sensors on your heart or sensors on your skull, and they can read out essentially this electromagnetic field. But now, if you've got very, very fine sensors, then you can have better and better resolution about the actual inside of what the exact electrical signals are and what the, how the current is running. So what you need is very, very fine sensors if you want to have higher resolution. And what you probably don't know is that we have made, in science, huge leaps in how well we can read out very, very fine changes in electromagnetic fields. So the biggest advances I don't even know about as a particle physicist, but I have seen some, and they're already impressive. So essentially now we have amazing capabilities to read out small changes in field. That's one ingredient you need, and with this very fine sensors, you can essentially place sensors around electrical activity and read it out from the fields. But then, of course, if you're something like the human brain, there's so many electrical pulses running, so the actual pattern that it will generate will be very, very complex, and you'd have to read it out in great detail. Now, what we also have is an incredible increase in computing power. And this computing processing power allows us to actually read out these electrical field signals and have a computer analyze it very, very rapidly. And then any sort of electromagnetic signal, just like, when you have, for example, voice signals. So voice is just sound. It's not electromagnetic. It's just, vibrations in air. Already you have this sort of software, which if you hear a person speak, all these little bars appearing and are showing you what sort of frequencies are in their voice. So my voice has got a fairly narrow band, for example. But male voices, and depending on how many harmonics you have in your voice, you might have a very broad spectrum. So you can already tell people apart based on their voice print. And what you would do is just, you hear the voice and you recognize the person, but a computer would essentially take in the sound signal and then decompose it into all the different frequencies that are there. So when I speak, I've got certain tones that are very high, certain are very deep. And when I speak, it's just an up and down with lots and lots of frequencies. And then, because I'm not, for example, like a flute or an organ pipe, which just gives you one frequency, just one tone, when I'm speaking, there are lots and lots of tones intermixed, which are then intermingled to create human speech. So what a computer can do is decompose your voice into all the different tones, if you like, all the different pitches. And the pitch is a frequency, is a certain frequency in the sound. And then what you'll see in this kind of voice analysis software is all these like different bars, which will show you there's lots of deep frequencies and lots of high frequencies, and you will have this kind of like, you know what I mean, these kind of visualizations whereby the voice is decomposed and you've got these different lines just running up and down, and what this is essentially a Fourier transform. The mathematical construct is a Fourier transform of this. It will decompose what you hear into the different frequencies. So, and that's just for a sound wave, and you can do the same thing for an electromagnetic wave. You can then, instead of just sound, you are detecting the electromagnetic wave. Like light is, for example, an electromagnetic wave, and light you can also decompose into different colors, and different colors are different frequencies. And we can do the same thing for electromagnetic waves that are outside the visible spectrum. So we only see a very narrow range, as much as we only hear a very narrow range. Bats have very high pitch, which you cannot hear anymore, so they use this kind of echo sound to navigate, so they can see with their ears, which is why they've got bigger ears than they have eyes, because they use sound to see. So you can use light to see or sound to see, and just like that, light is made up of different frequencies, just like sound is made up of different frequencies, and light that we cannot see is also made up of different frequencies. And light is just an electromagnetic wave. So any sort of electromagnetic wave you can analyze, you can decompose. If several frequencies are overlaid, you can decompose them using a Fourier transform, and you can then mathematically say this wave, if it's a sound wave, a visible light wave, or an invisible light wave, is made up of all these frequencies. And if I overlay these frequencies, you will get back exactly the sound wave. So a computer can listen to your voice, it can take all the different frequencies, pass it to another computer that has never heard you speak, and if that computer takes the different frequencies and puts them together again, it can generate your voice. And that's exactly what happens when you're talking over the telephone, because your sound waves are going into the device, they are decomposed, they are sent across the system, and then on the other end, that is generated back, these frequency components, into a sound wave again, and then your best friend hears your voice on the phone. So this is nothing fancy, okay? We've done it now for absolutely decades. And the only thing that's new for you, you take your telephone for granted, but remember, you're not speaking down a pipe anymore. It's turned into electromagnetic signals, and they are passed on and so on. And that's because they got, decomposed, and it's this print that we're sending, and it's, generated back into a sound wave. Now, what I'm saying is that you can do the same thing with all electromagnetic signals. So you can do the same thing with visible light, with invisible light, with radio frequencies, with microwave frequencies, with everything, all electromagnetic waves. And I've told you in the beginning that any current that's, flowing along a cable or a little, conducting path will generate an electromagnetic field, an electromagnetic wave. So, with it fine enough sensors and enough computing power, you can take any sort of electromagnetic wave and decompose it using a Fourier transform into its frequency pattern. It's kind of like a fingerprint. What sort of frequencies is it made up of? And then you can take the same frequencies, and another computer can put them together and generate an electromagnetic wave. Do you understand? So I'm now taking what you know about your telephone and we're applying it to, light waves. So for example, your TV or your computer screen, right, also takes different light components and generates the image of me, right? So my image is going into the camera there, okay, it's decomposed, sent over the network, and then your screen generates my image for you. Okay, so that you understand. You've now understood it for sound wave, you understand it for visible light, and now imagine the electromagnetic waves that your brain is emitting are invisible. But it doesn't mean that they don't exist, because you can put sensors, little sensors on your skull, and then you can read it out. And now what I'm telling you is that these little sensors that read out your brain activity do not have to be on your skull. They can also be away. And if the sensors are fine enough, they will pick up the activity inside your brain just the same. And then the better your processing power and the finer your sensors, the further away they can be from your head. Do you see? So with fancier and fancier technology, you can, at some point you can just have like a helmet that doesn't even touch you and read out your signals, But then there are also other ways where you can stimulate the brain. For example, you can irradiate someone's head or irradiate a muscle, a certain muscle, then see what activity it generates inside the head. So, if you shine something onto my muscle, an electromagnetic pulse that then makes my muscles contract, because, when I'm contracting these muscles, I'm also sending electrical signals, an electromagnetic pulse along. So you can also do the same thing externally and then make muscles contract, you maybe have done this in biology, you have maybe a frog or something that's already dead, unfortunately, but then you take a, what's it called, like a conductor, and you just hold it there and you electroshock the frog, and you can just make the legs contract, because you're sending electromagnetic pulse along the arm. So basically there are many different ways to read out the activity inside the brain, and you can think about fancy experiments, how you could, maybe trigger a muscle and then read out how the brain activity changes, or you can do the same thing in reverse. You've read out the brain activity and you're just now irradiating the head, and you're forcing, because the electromagnetic field is now forcing a current inside your head to flow, and then you can trigger, the nerves. And what you can do in detail depends on how sophisticated your equipment is, but in principle all of this is possible. So if someone approaches you and says, you know what, my limbs are being moved remotely, it could be two things. It could be someone just sent an electromagnetic pulse and shot it into their muscles, and then their muscles and their nerves reacting to this electromagnetic pulse, and they're suddenly reading out. It's the same as if the brain had sent the signal, but instead the signal is external. So you can make literally people's muscles jerk by just sending electromagnetic pulses of the right frequency, shoot them into their arms so that it triggers their nerves, and that can be done. So when people say, oh, my limbs are being moved, do not assume, oh, they're crazy, or there's this new disease that now everybody thinks that their limbs are being moved remotely. No, just think, hang on, we are now in an era where it's all electromagnetic signals, electromagnetic pulses everywhere, Wi-Fi and mobile phones, and it's all electromagnetic signals. So perhaps what this person is talking about is that they're being, maybe harassed or bothered by someone following them around and shooting an electromagnetic pulse into their arm for harassment and moving their arm, because that is possible. So this would be remote, muscle control, essentially, muscle pulsing, as I call it. That is entirely possible. And then there's much more insidious ways. And, as you can imagine, the military and the intelligence agencies have got access to the cutting edge stuff. So, they will have access to this thing where you don't even have to have sensors on someone's brain to read out their brain print. And with brain print, I mean this very individual signature that your brain will generate, because the way the connections are running inside your head, that is grown organically, so it will be unique to you, and you will have made connections, and you would have learned as a baby to move your limbs. You know how when a baby is born, at first they're kind of cute and funny, because they are, want to touch their face, and they, hit themselves in the face and stuff like that. Well, that is the brain learning how to actually handle the different limbs and the fingers, because when a baby is growing as a fetus, eventually this kind of like the brain starts firing signals, and the baby starts kicking, and actually a baby kicking inside a mother, as unpleasant as that might be, is actually a good sign, because it means its brain is now firing up. It's starting already to learn how to move around, because once a baby is born, it has to have already these capabilities. So it's already learning how to, basic stuff of how to push its legs, and stuff like that. So it will have some sort of movement, but it will be very restricted. And then when a baby is born, the neural circuitry is building up, and it will bit by bit learn how to move its fingers. And then as it gets older, after a couple of years, you can teach it how to play the piano or how to play a flute, and bit by bit it will learn how to move its tongue for speech, how to move its fingers, and so on. But the way this little thing is just wiring up its brain will be very, very individual. So every single one of us, depending on in what order we learn certain things, did you learn how to play the violin? Did you learn how to play the piano? Or your very, very specific childhood experiences and in your personal path will determine how the wiring happens. There are similarities between people, and that's why medical books can say, okay, this area is in charge of speech, and that area is in charge of moving maybe this side of your limbs and that side of your limbs, and so on. So there are similarities, roughly speaking, but then also finer details will be very individual. So now we have the situation that if someone can read out your very specific brain circuitry from the electromagnetic waves that your head radiates off, and if he or she then radiates it back, as much as the current moving will generate a field, similarly, a field impinging on a conductor will generate a current. So, the two things are connected. And one will have the other as the result. And similarly, the other will have the former as the result. So, when someone has read out your personal brain print and will shine it on your head, essentially force the current inside your head to flow a certain way, he can, or she can, in principle, control your limbs in a way that is very unique to you, or control your thoughts or your emotions. And it sounds sci-fi, but then again, so many other things sounded sci-fi before. The car sounded sci-fi in the days when we only had horse carriages. The computer sounded sci-fi in the days when we only had typewriters, And mobile phones sounded just so sci-fi just a couple of years before, when mobile phones were either this big or, we only had wired telephones, and, people would have thought, what, you're telling me that one day there will be like, yeah, a satellite system, an entire freaking satellite system there just for you, just so that you can send each other, WhatsApp messages over like a little device. Yeah, right, But then again, here it is, So sounded sci-fi before, but now it's not. And similarly, this is now, if people are being attacked or tested upon with military technology, then of course it will be classified, of course it will be ahead of what you know. That's just what you expect, right? The military is not going to test equipment from the 1970s, right? Because they know how that works. Okay, so they're not going to bother with that. If they test anything on people, it will be new stuff, so stuff you haven't heard about. So I'm telling you that now the scientific development is such that, we can read out the electrical signals from the brain, and we can force the current inside the brain to flow a certain way based on these signals by just sending the signals back. And this means, because depending on what you want to do, it could be very similar between people. So if you just want to make their limbs or one side of their body jerk around, then it's very easy, because you radiate the other side of their skull. So, this brain hemisphere is in charge of that side of your body, and this brain hemisphere is in charge of this side of your body. So, if you just want to say left or right, then this will be very common to all human beings. And if you just irradiate, the left-hand side of any human being, you will be moving the right, okay? But then there are other things like thoughts and feelings, which might again have similarities between human beings, but might also be quite specific. So, you see that the more detailed you would like to get, the more you need very, very detailed, very sensitive sensors to read out the brain print, and very, very good computers and very high processing power to then, demodulate the signal that you're getting and make sense of it, because so many things will be overlaid. But now the processing power seems to be there, that if you read out one signal, once over 5 minutes, and you say you've got a week to just send it to an entire server farm, then you might be able to deconstruct it, so after a week you can send the signal back and suddenly steer a human being. Do you see? So it's all dependent on the sensitivity of our electromagnetic field sensors and our processing power. And both of these capabilities have just exploded exponentially. Processing power for sure, but also the sensitivity, So then, if people say, my limbs are being controlled, it could be because they are being pulsed externally, and pulse is being shot through their window or maybe even their wall, that then suddenly jerks their limbs or makes their muscles cramp, and then you have to think, okay, this person, if it's not a neurological disease, then this person most likely is probably being tested upon, or fired at with this technology. And when they say, oh, I've got the feeling that, my thoughts are being read out, or my speech, there's something called subvocal speech, and some of it is just generated in your head, but sometimes, for example, when you're typing your password, you kind of say, let's say your password is banana. Don't pick banana, because, everybody picks banana, so pick a safe password, but let's say it's banana. And then, when you actually, before you type it and you think, what's my password? You would internally already think, oh, banana. And then when you're typing it out, you might almost like move your lips. And if you're not moving your lips, you might, without noticing, actually pass air through your vocal cords without making an audible sound. But you would say, banana, inside. And your tongue might move, and your vocal cords might actually resonate, just like as if you'd said it out loud, but just much weaker, so you don't make an audible sound. But if, say, you could irradiate your thyroid or your throat, and actually read out, you know, the air and these vibrations very, very precisely, you can already see that with that someone who's got special equipment might be able to pick that up, you know, or might be able to reconstruct it. And if we're now talking military type technology, classified technology, that's maybe 15, 20 years ahead of what has been made public, and someone says, you know, I think somebody is reading out my subvocal speech, then again, don't say, oh, this is crazy. Say, well, if you're not crazy, if otherwise you come across as perfectly normal, then let's not assume you have this kind of weird disease that keeps you normal in any other way, but just on this particular topic sends you crazy. That's very unlikely. Instead, rather think, hang on, can I imagine that this could be done? That there could be maybe that you might be tested upon against your will with military technology, because you know how big the military intelligence complex is. You know that they want human test subjects, because these, you know, anything that's military is not against animals, it's against human beings. So, you know, you would have to test it. Your enemies will be human beings. You know, maybe robots one day, but today it's human beings. So they will test it on human beings. So they would then, you know, try it out on unsuspecting people. So when unsuspecting people come forward and say these things like, oh, subvocal speech is being read out, my brain print, my thoughts are being read out, my emotions are being read out, or even influenced, think military tech. Don't think crazy straight away, because then you underestimate just how big the military intelligence complex is. It's massive. It's like, you know, mind-blowing fractions of GDP, you know, and in actual real terms, how many thousand people work on that, what, like, you know, gazillions of different gizmos being developed and having to be tested and stuff like that. So do not underestimate that, you know, because this is now a proliferating industry that sometimes is just manned by ruthless people who just love war, you know. That's why they work in military tech and not making baby toys, you know. So the people manufacturing baby toys and people manufacturing like weapons for war will be different sort of people, you know. And those who make military kits might, you know, also just grab innocent people who are helpless and just, you know, shoot at them and see what happens, and then just discard them and throw them away. Do you see? So when these things happen, so remote neural monitoring sounds like, in most cases, what I've seen, exactly like this technology that, you know, is still classified, but there's enough reason to believe that this is actually exists. For example, because there's a leaked document. There's a leaked document which I shall also post later on, which says exactly this is what it is. You know, we had the Human Brain Project being announced by Barack Obama, the really big project to decode the brain. So now when innocent people come forward and say, I think my brain has been decoded, then you think, oh, you must be mad. No. Did you just hear about this multi-billion, you know, dollars, pounds project that's just been announced? Sounds like what she's saying to you, no? Or he. Sounds just like it, you know. So when a multi-billion project to read out brain prints is being announced, then you probably expect, given the ruthlessness of certain men, and no doubt also women, inside the military intelligence complex, that they would just grab innocent people, test on them, and then throw them away. So, you see, so this is how to understand remote neural monitoring. What it is essentially people being grabbed, you know, randomly, and then their electromagnetic signals are being read out and then fed back to them, and all sorts of things are being done to them. And what is being done to them in detail, they can tell you. So listen to their testimony carefully, and depending on how much you know about technology, you can reverse engineer what has been done to them. But basically this is what you would expect, you know, it's electromagnetic signals. With that you can move muscles, because this is all done with electromagnetic signals. And neural activity inside your head again is generating electromagnetic signals. So with these advances in processing power and the sensitivity of our electromagnetic sensors that measure fields, you can now, I'm telling you, read out people's brain activity. And to what sort of sensitivity just depends on how much money you have and how advanced your kit is. There you go.